So today I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson. Prager University put out a video defending Thomas Jefferson and his statues across the United States, specifically the one that was torn down in Portland, Oregon earlier this year. I hope to make the case that Jefferson is not someone worthy of a statue in modern America, and that his statues should in fact be torn down. And I hope to do this by examining his behavior, racism, hypocrisy, and ideologies over the course of his life. And before I jump into the Prager University video, I want to take a look at my favorite quote from Thomas Jefferson. It's one that speaks to revolution and the revolutionary spirit and the voices of people who are oppressed rising up and trying to get their voice heard. In her letter to James Madison, Jefferson writes, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and is necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. Unsuccessful rebellions indeed generally establish the encroachments on the rights of the people which have produced them. An observation of this truth should render honest Republican governors so mild in their punishment of rebellions as not to discourage them too much. It is a medicine necessary for the sound health of government." I believe that this quote represents the reasons why BLM should continue to function in the way that it does and should make a lot of people heard. I also need to point out that Jefferson, while he had this great passage, ended up being a hypocrite about this when it challenged his own authority later in his life, which I will go into and show. With all of that said, let's jump in and take a look at the Prager University video.
Who was Thomas Jefferson?
Protesters are on their way back to the high school right here, and I want to show you something different that we found. So check out this statue of Thomas Jefferson. You can see it's been toppled over, and it's just on the cement right here.
Statues of great historical figures like Thomas Jefferson are being torn down across America. Here are some facts about Jefferson that remind us why a statue should remain. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at 33, became the first Secretary of State, second Vice President, and served 2 terms as the 3rd President of the United States. Among America's founders, only George Washington played a more crucial role.
So, all of those statements are generally true about Jefferson. Those are the positions that most people would think of when you promote his accomplishments over the course of his life. He wrote the Declaration of Independence. He had a great political influence in the United States. He was Secretary of State under Washington and all of this other stuff that they mentioned, right? But I want to take into account some of his other writings and some of his positions while in those positions of authority. And I want to start with the Notes on the State of Virginia that he wrote in 1781. In Query 14, he actually outlined what it would look like for slaves to be free in the state of Virginia. And I'm going to read a bunch of the quotes and then I hope to comment on it after. One of the things that he was explicitly asking for is when that the slaves were emancipated after passing a proposed act in Virginia for the freeing of slaves, that they should become colonized. And what this basically meant is that Jefferson wanted to free all the slaves, send them over to some other place, presumably Africa, and colonize that land in Africa so that they could continue to have this very paternal relationship with Black people, because Jefferson was not convinced that Black people were capable of any sort of higher reason or thought, which is shown when he says, "Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous." Further going on to say, "But never yet could I find a Black that had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never see even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture." And further going on to say, "I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, that Blacks, whether originally a distinct race, or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. It is not against experience to suppose that different species of the same genus, or varieties of the same species, may possess different qualifications." So while Jefferson was taking this position that slaves should be free, he was also establishing a root of white supremacy in the United States. And I think that's an important position to understand when we examine Jefferson in history. He was a proto white supremacist. He believed not only for creating a literal white state by having all of the black people removed into some other place and continue to be colonized, of course, probably taking over their labor. But further, he believed that there was an inherent difference, as if they were not even the same genus or species. Like, he had an understanding that there was a difference between the two that was so inherent because of the characteristics there. And instead of exploring the idea in great detail that it could perhaps be slavery that was a huge factor in some of the people's oppression and inability to learn, he decided to take it as an inherent understanding. Both of these positions are white supremacist in origin, and I think that examining Thomas Jefferson as a white supremacist is an important aspect of the historical narrative. To further defend this position, in 1791, a black mathematician named Benjamin Banneker had appealed to Jefferson and had made the claim that he did not understand why Jefferson could not see his own hypocrisy. He stated, "Here, sir, was a time in which your tender feelings for yourselves had engaged you thus to declare you were then impressed with proper ideas of the great valuation of liberty, and the free possession of those blessings to which you were entitled by nature. By sir, how pitiable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, and of his equal and impartial distribution of those rights and privileges which he had conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies, in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others, with respect to yourselves." And what he's essentially claiming is that because the colonies had claimed that they were the slaves of the King of England and had found liberty through that black people being kept in the same type of chains was a hypocrisy. He also goes on in this document to send Jefferson an almanac of astronomical charts and everything that he had created. And Jefferson actually does have a slight turnabout with this, but it's very, very quickly undermined. Jefferson did respond and said, "Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degradation condition of their existence both in Africa and in America." So here we have kind of a weird progressive stance where Jefferson seems to get it, but on the exact same day when he actually contacts the Monsieur de Condorcet of the Secretary of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, he ends up writing, with sharing the almanac with him, "I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the wants of talents observed in them is merely the effect of their degraded condition, and not proceeding from any difference in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends." So this one person wasn't enough evidence for him. He needed to see more. He needed to see a consistent amount of evidence of a great deal of black people who were capable of more. Never mind the fact that he's already accused black people of not having sound body when they were performing most of the labor on the plantation, which I'm sure Jefferson was not capable of doing, especially in his condition of, spending more time with a pen than with doing any actual labor. So what we can see from this and what ends up happening is that Jefferson, over the course of his lifetime, fluctuates between these two perspectives. Well, is it slavery or is it a natural inherent thing? And the thing that I need to point out here in terms of his roots of white supremacy is that this is still an issue that goes on today. There are still people arguing whether the history of slavery that has led into racial oppression in the United States, that has gone through the path line of, slavery to Jim Crow to the prison pipeline and just systemic racism in general over the course of US history is the reason why a lot of people of color are poor and a lot of people of color are suffering in the United States right now. And there are still people to this day that make the claim that it's some sort of natural inferiority or just, the whole 1350 statistic of 13% of the population causing 50% of the crime and not contextualizing any of that or bringing up any of the reasons behind anything that's going on. And just not having an understanding of people of color and their experiences in general. And because of all that, Jefferson here is touching on the exact same internal debate that is still an issue in America. And because of that, and because we need to assert that Black Lives Matter, because we need to assert these positions and actually speak to the condition that slavery has led to systemic racism and that this is an actually valid claim, his white supremacist position that is fairly consistent over the course of his lifetime, that there is some level of a naturalness to it, does not speak to me accepting that he has statues and is being praised and valued in a multicultural America. Furthermore, I wanted to talk about Jefferson as Secretary of State and as President, and just go over some examples of how his position as Secretary of State and President, his political power, diminished a lot of the rights of people of color. So during his time in office, Jefferson was Secretary of State when the French Revolution was going on, and then therefore the Haitian Revolution was going on. And Jefferson's response to Haiti was as such. Jefferson believed strongly in the French Revolution and the ideals it promoted. But as a Virginia slaveholder, popular among other Virginia slaveholders, Jefferson also feared the specter of slave revolt. When faced with the question of what the United States should do about the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Jefferson favored offering limited aid to suppress the revolt, but also suggested that slave owners should aim for a compromise similar to Jamaican slaveholders made with communities of escaped slaves in 1739. And so that's actually speaking to the Maroon War that happened in Jamaica, where basically the British were forced, because of the very strong position of the Maroon organizations in the mountains of Jamaica, to basically let them have a bunch of land and be free and be kept away from the slavery and plantation system. And they got a ton of land from it, and they actually negotiated. And Toussaint Louverture, I don't think I pronounced that correctly. Toussaint Louverture. I'm gonna just skip it. I'm in my act. The thing's coming out wrong. But anyway, under President Thomas Jefferson's presidency, Toussaint's position was undercut, and the United States actually cut aid to him, and instead pursued a policy to isolate Haiti, and thus a friendly republic actually in the world that they could have allied with, fearing that the Haitian Revolution would spread to the US, and Haiti would then not be represented or, seen and recognized by the United States until 1862. That would again be under Lincoln. So, given all of this, we can assume that even though Jefferson made the quote that I put out at the beginning, he was fearful of a slave revolt, probably because he knew it meant his own head. Probably because he knew that his own slaves would not be happy with the position that he took on certain instances of their abuse and the violence he administered to them. So given all of that, let's get back into Prager University. Actually, no, I want to go with one more. My bad. So Jefferson on Native Americans, actually, during this time, when he was president of the United States, he thought through treaties and commerce, Jefferson hoped to continue to get Native Americans to adopt European agricultural practices, shift to a sedentary way of life, and free hunting grounds up for further white settlement. Jefferson suggested that if the various Indian nations could be encouraged to purchase goods on credit, they would be likely to fall into debt, which they could relieve through the sale of lands to the government. The civilization program would thus aid the Indians in accordance to Enlightenment principles at the same time further white interests. So essentially, he took the position with Native Americans that they had to be made white, that they had to be tricked into selling their ancestral lands. And this, of course, being part of the lands in Louisiana that he purchased during the course of his presidency as well. So he was not a friend to the native peoples. And in fact, we have a word for this historically, the destruction of a culture and identity through systematic means. It's typically called genocide in the modern era. And I know that there's a lot of issues around applying terms like genocide into historical contexts, but by today's standards, this would be a policy of genocide. So that's how I tend to look at his presidency, his position as Secretary of State, and all the other things that he did. That said, back to the video for reals.
He was a gifted violinist, enthusiastic dancer, renowned architect, and noted inventor. He even conceived of the swivel chair. His private library of 6,500 volumes counted as one of America's largest.
So, I mean, obviously he was a very talented person, and he had a large library. Of course, that library of 6,500 books was funded off of the slave plantation. I don't think I need to explain that more than that. He made all of his money off of slave labor, and thus he was given time to invent, create, and otherwise do the great things that he did.
In 1962, President Kennedy welcomed Nobel Prize winners by declaring this is the most extraordinary collection of talent gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
I don't know what this has to do with anything, because John F. Kennedy saying that Thomas Jefferson was great is not that big of a deal. You know, there was a huge movement on Thomas Jefferson's birthday to have a celebration where a president claimed some sort of great facts about him. But it was actually like Woodrow Wilson actually stated that he was a great man, but a terrible American. And so, like, what do modern presidents or even like presidents from the last 100 years or so have to do with anything Jefferson did? It's just hero worship and purporting the mythology of America. This doesn't do anything at all.
His wife Martha, who accompanied his violin playing on the harpsichord, died at 33 after her 7th pregnancy, with only 2 daughters surviving past childhood. Martha asked Jefferson never to remarry. He agreed and kept his promise. His wife's half-sister, Sally Hemings, had been conceived in a relationship between Jefferson's father-in-law on his plantation. Many, but not all, historians believe Jefferson conducted a 38-year relationship with Sally.
So speaking on this, full disclosure, trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about some stuff and I'm going to have to be perfectly real on this. This relationship was rape. This relationship was a huge, huge problem in terms of power dynamics. There's no evidence from Sally Hemings on her account of any of this. We only have Jefferson's words and Sally Hemings' son's perspective on this to collaborate this whole story and to explain what happened. And of course, the son wasn't there for a good portion of that experience. So, what do we know about Jefferson and Sally Hemings? Well, before we specifically get into that, we know what Jefferson's position was in terms of women slaves. Jefferson also encouraged and wielded control over enslaved families, particularly the bodies of enslaved women. I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as an addition to the capital, Jefferson wrote. Like many planters in the 19th century, Jefferson sought to capitalize on the rising value of enslaved human bodies, who were increasingly being mortgaged, sold, and leased and insured for the financial benefit of their owners. And this is from Monticello, the website that represents the land of the plantation that Jefferson lived on, and as well as all of his slaves. So Jefferson was quite aware of the position of how he controlled the women's bodies on his plantation, that he was able to utilize them literally to produce more people in the way one might do so in terms of producing more animals in today's society. There is a huge problem in that understanding. Jefferson was quite aware of that. So when we factor that in to the relationship with Sally Hemings, that he had to, on some level, be aware of his own position in that. And if he had ignorance on that, then that only makes it worse from my perspective. There's no good way of looking at this. He used his power dynamic in order to ensure that he was able to get with his sister-in-law, who was also a slave. Also, she was 14. And I know that there's a different perspective in terms of what age a woman was considered a woman at that time period. Anyone older than 12 would have been likely considered a woman. But when Jefferson had the affair with the 14-year-old Sally Hemings, he was a 44-year-old man. And I don't care how you slice that, that's disgusting. Modern sensibilities, historical sensibilities, I don't care. When you're a 44-year-old man with a 14-year-old girl, there's a huge problem there, especially when she is literally your property. And some historians have actually made the claim that, technically speaking, Jefferson's wife had very little say in certain parts of their relationship when it came to sexual activity as well. But I'd argue that it was much worse for Hemings because of the, of course, intersectionality of her being black and a slave, and thus not being able to refuse her master's advances. Even if you could make the claim that there was affection there, which I don't buy entirely, I don't believe that it's true. And the fact that Prager University is calling it into question slightly by proposing that many but not all historians believe this is just a ridiculous statement. Monticello website actually purports, and has this on their website, years after his wife's death, Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 of Sally Hemings' children, 4 survived to adulthood, and are mentioned in Jefferson's plantation records: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston Hemings. And the position that Sally Hemings had to take was, while she was in Paris with Jefferson between 1787 and 89, she was given a sort of choice to remain free in Paris or to go back to the plantation and presumably be able to spend time with her family. And she was able to bargain at a very young age of 16 for a position where she could get enhanced privileges for her and her kids to be freed at the age of 21. If you don't think that that was all done with some level of coercion, then I don't think you understand the power dynamic that's at play here. Yes, she was able to bargain. Yes, she was able to do certain things. Yes, she took a position that was probably beneficial on some level for her, but that doesn't mean she wasn't literally subject to his will in these positions. So, given all of that, I do not believe Hemings could have consented, and that all of this is just a really messed up situation that Jefferson found himself in. Friends of his actually found it problematic that some of his children were slaves working on his plantation. The fact is, not only was his sister-in-law, who was literally the son of the daughter, rather, not only was he having an affair with his sister-in-law after his wife said, please do not marry anyone else, the sister-in-law was the product of a slave master, his wife's father, raping another woman on his plantation. So this is now multi-generational. And by the time you get to these kids, they're working on the plantation for Jefferson until the age of 21. And by this point, he does free them by near the end of his life, and he does keep his word on that. But they inherit none of his wealth or status or privilege. And he just basically left them with nothing. And if you want more proof that solidifies this, there's actually DNA evidence to prove this. In January of 2000, the committee reported that the weight of all evidence from the DNA study, original documents, written and oral history accounts, and statistical data indicated at a high probability that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Eston Hemings, and that he was likely the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children listed in Monticello records. So, the point I'm getting at with all of this is that none of the historians actually believe at this point, any credible historian does not believe that Jefferson was not the parent of these kids. There's enough evidence both from the time period and from the historical record and DNA evidence that tied the chromosome line to specific aspects of Jefferson's DNA and not some other people's DNA that was purported to be the father of Hemming's children. So, again, Prager University is being dishonest here, and we need to take that into account. There were historians in the past that did believe that this might be fictional, but the DNA evidence is pretty much the thing that solidified it for most historians. Let's finish up this video and wrap things up.
Producing as many as 6 enslaved children. Jefferson.
Also, are they really counting that as a position in favor of him having a statue? That he raped Sally Hemings and put her in an uncomfortable position? That's really not a valid position. In fact, I think that furthers my argument that he's not someone worthy of a statue for being a hypocrite on a lot of positions. Especially when a lot of his positions really defined that the races should not mix and all this other white supremacy bullshit that he was putting out there.
Ran twice against John Adams for president, losing in 1796 and winning in 1800. They died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, the Jubilee 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, on which they'd collaborated.
So, in conclusion, based on the evidence that we've seen, Jefferson was not good to people of color in this country. He did not value any of his positions. The idea of freedom and liberty was only meant to apply in his eyes to a very specific group of people, specifically white men. And he spoke in a language of white supremacy, and while he might have questioned more than some of his peers in the South, he certainly does not ring as someone that I want looking down as a statue upon people who are the, descendants of all of that history. Why should a person of color have to walk down the street and recognize the face of a white man who would have seen them as beneath them, and someone inferior? Why should someone have to walk down the street knowing that? There are contextualized places that we can have statues of Jefferson at Monticello Plantation, as well as having, an entire exhibit devoted to the history of slavery there. You can have it at any museum that would talk about the histories of presidents of the United States. There are places and locations for this. They don't need to be in public squares. They don't need to be at the center of all these places, especially given his racism, and especially given that he was a horrible slave owner who was quite cruel to his slaves. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.